All right, well, good morning. Glad you're all here. Guys, I really want to just challenge you real quick as we start this message to be here on March the 3rd. That's this coming Saturday. We do breakfast. It's going to be an awesome time of just hanging out, getting to know each other, building a community of men that can really make an impact. I think the Bible is very clear. As men and fathers lead, so the family and the church also will go. So I hope you'll be here for that. It's going to be a great time. Wrapping up our current series on community, and man, this has honestly been one of my favorite series we've done. We spent week 1 talking about how back in Genesis with Adam and Eve, there was an innate design and a need for community between creation and creator, and then with one another. So I mean, that was awesome. And then we followed that up with talking about conflict, right? Because anytime there is relationship, there will be conflict. And so we talked about a healthy way to handle those and how to actually use conflict to move forward and improve the relationship, as opposed to removing the relationship from our life, which is usually the route most people go these days. And then I feel like last week, Pastor Brandon, he just hit the nail on the head when he confronted us all, and he just said, hey, commitment is really an issue. We're not the American church in general, but even our church, we're a lot more of a convenient Christian as opposed to a committed Christian. And he just sort of called us out on that and basically said, hey, our church doesn't truly resemble what community should look like. And if we're honest, all of us can admit that we fall short in that at different times. And so today's message is going to be, I think, equally as uncomfortable as last week's message. We're going to talk about like one of the things that no church ever wants to talk about, and one of the things that most people complain about, pastors talking about, and that's going to be giving and generosity and those types of things. So it's going to be an uncomfortable message, but I think it's definitely something that is really lacking in the American church. And the thing is, before we can teach on generosity and giving and that type of thing, we have to understand and be committed, right? Because my generosity is never going to outpace my commitment. And so that's why we talked last week about commitment, and just before we can even begin to gauge our own generosity, we have to be honest about where we would say we are in being committed to new life, being a committed Christian and following Jesus. We have to analyze the one before the other. And I would say, to be perfectly honest, we're pretty selfish as individuals. We're pretty stingy. I think that's why pastors are so afraid to get up and talk about it, because for some reason people think that that's not their place. There's always a lot of backlash with that. But it made me think of a time when Julie and I went to Costco. If you're not familiar with Costco, it's a lot like Sam's Club. You have to have a membership to go there. And so we happened to go on Super Bowl weekend. That was a terrible idea, by the way. Awful. And as I was standing in the membership line, I kept watching these flat screen TVs leave and these sound systems. And I'm not talking like the $250 Walmart special TVs, right? I'm talking multiple $1,000 TVs, $1,000 sound systems. And it reinforced something that I already knew. When we want to be part of a community, the expense is no problem. It's not an issue, right? The Carolina Panthers happened to be playing in the Super Bowl, if you could call what they did playing at that time, that weekend. And so all of these people decided they were going to be a part of the community of the Carolina Panthers. And so they were willing to spend exorbitant amounts of money on TVs to watch from their house. Right? We have all of these things in our world that have demands on our time, on our abilities, and on our money, and we're okay with that. But somehow, when it comes to Jesus and when it comes to church, that's out of line. Like that's a no-no. Right? I saw on Facebook last week, one of my friends is utilizing GoFundMe to pay for a speeding ticket. Somehow that's okay. Right? We'll utilize GoFundMe for all kinds of things, and we'll do fundraisers for our schools, but somehow when it comes to church, that's a line that we shouldn't cross. Right? When it comes to what we're called to be a family of believers, somehow we can't afford it, we don't have the time. That's why our generosity will never outpace our commitment. Because we're committed to so many things. Unless I'm committed here, my generosity will always be unsustainable. And I think there's some disconnects there that we can talk about this morning, and we'll get to those with regard to generosity and maybe more importantly, our motivation behind being generous. And I think that could change some things if we clarify those. But I want to begin with something very, very simple. Because generosity, the way that I understand it and the way that I see it as I read through the Bible, generosity is always rooted in love. I give out of a love for whatever that may be. All right, and if you think about it, that's true, that's foundational. So then we go and we read where Jesus tells us in John 13:35 that the world will know we are his disciples by our love. So we have this issue where Christianity is becoming less and less relevant in the world, and I think it's because we're not generous, because we don't maybe love people the way we're supposed to. Just maybe a thought as we begin to work through some presumptions about generosity, and I'm going to structure this message a little bit different. Because when I think when it comes to being generous, we major in the minors. And if you don't know what that means, like we're focused on some small things that aren't necessarily as important as the big things. So the framework I want to work from is that generosity is more about this than that. I'm not saying whatever our second topic is not about generosity. I'm saying maybe we focus on that too much. And maybe understanding where our focus should be could reframe that just a little bit. And so that brings us to our first point this morning. And it's that generosity is more about attitude than amount. Right? Inevitably, we measure things in numbers. It's who we are, and especially when it comes to giving, whether that's amount given or time spent or things done, it's a checklist. We want a set of numbers. And I think it's because it's human nature to want a measurable device to see how we're performing. But I think it's also, if we're honest, that maybe it's so we can compare ourselves to everybody else and say, oh, well, I'm doing better than so-and-so, so I must be doing okay. Generosity that's done to impress people, generosity that's done to reach a measured milestone, that's not generosity at all. That's self-aggrandizement, or that's building myself up. In fact, 2 Corinthians 9:7 tells us that generosity is always more about attitude than amount. It says, each one must give as he has decided in his heart, not reluctantly or under compulsion, for God loves a cheerful giver. I don't know many of you could say that you know somebody who's happy about giving all the time. I would say that most of us, even if we are regular at giving or volunteering, cheerful doesn't categorize that. Maybe obligation categorizes that. And it's challenging because our world today, it screams more, me. Definitely doesn't say give. Definitely doesn't say help here. Just to be blunt, God's not impressed with the amount of money written on your check or the amount of time that you spend at church functions. It doesn't impress him. God is infinitely more concerned about the heart behind the giving. Generosity has never been about the amount you give, but rather about the motivation behind it. Why are you giving? Also, what is giving doing in your life? How is that helping you grow? How is that helping you mature? See, the normal argument that we hear is, well, we don't have enough, right? I barely got enough to get by with, or I'm super, super busy, so I'm going to give to God out of my leftovers, what I have left available. If you read the story of Cain and Abel, that didn't work out really well. God's not interested in your leftovers. God's interested in being the priority, number one. If you're using the YouVersion Bible app, you notice there's a bunch of scripture for this morning. I'm not reading verse for verse through all those scriptures. I'm going to be referencing different stories throughout, so those are there so you can go back and read them later if you would like. But as I was writing this message, I was reminded of a story that probably isn't as well known in Exodus chapter 36, and this is about the creation of the Ark of the Covenant. Now, if you don't know what the Ark of the Covenant is, it's a box that was carried by the priest. It had the Ten Commandments in it. It was where God resided with his people when they were in the desert until they got to a place where they could build the temple. So this is actually physically where God resided among the Israelites. Big deal, right? And so they're constructing this, so they've got all these craftsmen. And so Moses stands up in front of the people and says, hey, we've got to build this. It's got to be nice. We need you guys to bring stuff to us, okay? And we're not talking cheap stuff. We're talking gold, silver, really expensive wood. So comparatively, maybe cedar for us today. It would have been something native to them. And so these people start bringing, and the response is so great that Moses has to stand back up and say, okay, that's enough. Stop bringing things. Now, I have yet to be in a church where we ever had to say, okay, we've got enough, you can stop for this year. However, what impresses me the most was not the amount, because the amount was impressive, but it was the attitude of the people. Don't lose sight of the context here. We're talking about a nomadic tribe, a group of people that they don't have homes. They're walking around in the desert. They don't even have food, right? God's making manna fall from heaven to feed them every day. They were just enslaved for 200 years. There's no extra anything. And yet somehow there was plenty. There was more than enough material. There was more than enough time volunteered. They had too many craftsmen. See, the people had this attitude of generosity, and it had to be restrained, but I think it's because they were experiencing gratitude. They had just gone through the deliverance from Egypt. These people had just firsthand experienced the salvation of God from what looked to them to be a hopeless situation. You can't be generous until you're first thankful. And so I think maybe we aren't appreciative of what we already have. Because being thankful will foster generosity regardless how much stuff you have. I think Luke 21 tells maybe a more familiar story that reinforces this idea. This is the story of the widow's mite, if you're familiar with some of that. And basically what happens is Jesus and his disciples, they're watching these guys give their tithe. And so they keep coming up and they keep putting in large amounts of money, and they're making sure it's making lots of noise as it goes into the bucket, right? They want people to see, man, this guy gave a bunch, this guy gave a bunch, this guy's awesome. And then this poor lady walks up, this widow, this older lady, and she puts in a widow's mite, which is roughly 2 to 3 cents today. It's nothing at all, really. And Jesus looks at his disciples and says, she gave more than all of these guys. See, mathematically, that doesn't add up, right? I don't care how bad you are at math. You know that doesn't equate. And Jesus was pointing out the heart mattered more than the amount. Right? What did this lady, what did it indicate? Because it says she gave all that she had. It indicated an understanding of how God had blessed her to that point. But it also demonstrated a trust and a reliance in what he was going to do in her future. I think when we refuse to be generous, it makes light of what God has done in our lives to this point. But it also expresses doubt in the fact that God can handle our future. It's not about amount, it's about attitude, it's about trust, it's about faith. Probably the most popular and well-known story that can illustrate this is found in Matthew 14, right? Jesus feeds the 5,000 men. He had women and children as well. And there was a young boy. He had a couple loaves of bread and a few fish. And basically like he had a New Testament Happy Meal, right? And I'm hoping this kid was like 6, because if he's like 12, even this isn't going to feed him. And yet you've got all of these people who are hungry, and he wasn't capable of meeting that need, right? Sometimes we say, well, I'm just not going to, because there's no way I can make a dent. He definitely didn't understand how this small meal was going to do anything. He wasn't wealthy, but he was willing. Guys, God will do infinitely more with a willing heart than he ever will with a wealthy bank account. We've got to get in our minds that generosity is not about how much. God always deals with the why, because once you have the why, the what will take care of itself. Once your heart is in the right place, generosity can't help but be an overflow of that. And so what I've found over the years is attitude is often one of the hardest things to change, right? Habits are difficult. That's why almost all New Year's resolutions fail. It's not that they're a bad idea, it's that it's too hard for us to get up an extra 30 minutes and work out in the morning, right? It's just difficult. And so for me, personally, having a healthy perspective that often helps me with the right attitude. So how do we combat this mind mentality? How do we realize that giving and generosity is never about how much, but rather about my heart and my attitude and all of those things? How do I ingrain generosity? That brings us to our second point this morning. It helps me to remember that generosity is more about a response than a requirement. To put it as simply as I know how, you can't require generosity. By nature, generosity must be voluntary. When you require it, it becomes a bill. Right? I mean, if it's required and you have to pay it, requiring generosity turns a response into a legalistic religion. It makes us feel better, in a sense, because it adds something to our checklist that I can do, and then I know, okay, I have fulfilled my Christian duty for the week. Religion and requirements, they're comfortable because responses require a relationship, and relationships are messy. In case you don't know, generosity is messy. I realize that when churches do brave the topic of giving and generosity, they often talk about the tithe, right? Giving of 10% as it's established in the Old Testament and in the Jewish law. However, if you read a story in Genesis 14, we see an interaction between Abraham and Melchizedek, right? And so what has happened, there was a war. People came in, they took some stuff. Abraham's family happened to be some of the stuff they took. So Abraham gets some buddies, they go back and they take some of that stuff, including Abraham's family. And as you read through that story, you find that God has ordained this, that he delivers the army into Abraham's hand, that he guarantees Abraham's victory. In this interaction between these two men, Abraham then gives an offering. He gives 10% of everything that he got back to God through the high priest. Now, if you read that, you're like, oh, yeah, because you understand tithe is 10%. Here's why that matters. Because tithe isn't actually established until Leviticus chapter 27. Abraham wasn't required to do any of that. Abraham gave in response to how God had blessed him in his life to this point. It's a response, not a requirement. He looked back and he was amazed at how generous God had been in his own life, and he couldn't help but be generous back. He couldn't help but honestly give God back what was already God's. And I just want to preclude something else here. We take these verses that say, try to outgive me, I will outgive you. It's impossible to outgive God. And for some of us, we pay, and I say pay purposely there, into what we view as maybe like the spiritual stock market, like I'm going to put it in and God's going to bless me later. It's going to be a spiritual dividend. Abraham's he's not making a down payment for next week. Generosity has nothing to do with tomorrow. If you are being generous in an effort to either A, get God's blessing, or B, increase your standing with God, you don't understand how God works. Again, it's back to the heart thing. It's irrelevant there. He was simply moved to response. It makes me wonder if my life lacks generosity, then does that mean that I really don't fully comprehend what God has done for me to this point? A few weeks ago in our Grace is Greater series, Pastor Brandon talked about forgiveness and being unwilling to forgive. And he had to go out on social media and clarify one of the verses. And his clarification was with regard to refusing forgiveness and how that can then lead to an eternity apart from God. And he clarified and said that refusing to forgive is a good indication that maybe you have never truly experienced forgiveness in the first place. It's probably likely then that you have never actually been saved. So he clarified that. And I would venture to say the exact same if our lives are not characterized by generosity. See, there's no possible way that I can fully understand and have experienced and encountered Jesus Christ. There's no way that I can understand his sacrifice on the cross in my place and not let that drive me to be generous. It's impossible. It's just the rain, it's okay. It's an impossibility to experience Jesus Christ, to understand the debt that I owed, that he paid freely, and still remain a selfish, self-centered person. I guess what I'm trying to say is encountering Jesus authentically creates life change. And that's the fundamental truth of Christianity, right? And I think it does that because it alters our perspective on what has value. All of a sudden, everything that I thought had value before, it's not nearly as valuable when I begin to see things the way that Jesus sees things. I think Zacchaeus experienced this. I'm sure most of you are familiar, right? Zacchaeus was a wee little man. Wee little man was he? All right, I got like 3 smiles out of that, so that's good. He climbed up in a tree. He wanted to see Jesus. So Jesus is walking by, stops, and he points and says, "Hey, I'm coming to your house for dinner." Now, Zacchaeus was a tax collector. What that means is he's a thief. He was basically allowed to distort the law however he wanted in order to steal money from anybody, any Jewish person. Not a very well-liked guy, as you can imagine, but he had amassed a large, ill-gotten fortune. Selfish and dishonest, that would definitely describe him. But his life changed after one genuine meeting with Jesus. He went from a taker of money to a giver of money. If you read that story in Luke 19, you'll see a change from a thief to a philanthropist. See, at the end of that story, Zacchaeus says, "Jesus, I'm going to give back 4 times what I've taken." Read carefully, because we always assume that Jesus just says, "Zacchaeus, you're going to do this," but he never does. It was simply a response to a relationship started with Jesus that sparked his generosity. And perhaps to me, one of the most amazing displays of generosity in the entire Old Testament, you can look in on Joseph in Genesis 45. Now, Joseph is the guy who was thrown into a pit, sold into slavery by his brothers, right? And spent a considerable amount of time in jail in Egypt. Well, by the time we get to this point, he's the second most powerful man in Egypt. And his family arrives to purchase food. Remember, the guys who sold him into slavery, because there's a famine. Now, for most people, this would be the perfect opportunity to pursue a grudge. And in my mind, if my brothers had sold me into slavery, I feel like I would still harbor a grudge. And yet, Joseph chose to practice generosity. He filled his brothers' sacks full of food, and then he put their money back in it and sent them on their way. See, he was generous when human nature said he had the right to be vindictive. What that says to me is that generosity is often a grace check. People who have experienced grace will then offer grace. And a lot of times that's going to look like generosity. How can we receive the gift of grace and not be generous with all that we have? I understand in today's society that there's a big argument between, the get a job people and the welfare people, and politics aside. Generosity, like grace, is never about what people deserve. God never asked us to pass a judgment on what people needed. It's about loving people where they are, regardless of their past and regardless of what society might say. Because that's what grace did for us. Grace didn't pass a judgment on where we were. It met us there. Because if grace was about what I deserved, we'd all be in trouble. Grace and generosity should know no borders, whether that's in our hearts or in the world. I think maybe the best illustration of this in the Bible comes from the story of the Good Samaritan. Because again, we have this tendency to trend back towards money, right? Generosity is always about money. The preacher's asking about money. But the Good Samaritan, he gave of his skills, he gave of his time, and he gave of his money. Generosity can be all three or one of the three. Either way. Right? In the story, you see a Jewish man he's attacked by robbers, right? And he's left to die. And then we see two Jewish men who are religious leaders in the Jewish community. They pass by and they have excuses. I'm too busy. I don't have the time. I've got to get here, about why they can't help this man. Now, culturally, Samaritans and Jews, they did not interact. But the Samaritan, he stops and he tends to this guy's wounds and he helps take him to an inn, and he pays some in advance and says to the innkeeper, take care of him. When I come back through, I'll pay you what else I owe you. I'm sure he had places to be. I'm sure he had a use for that money. And yet, all he saw was a need that he could meet, an opportunity. Christians should be the most generous people in the world. Just statement of fact. Because we understand better than anyone how immensely we have been blessed. We understand the generosity of a God who didn't owe us anything, of a God that we had mistreated, that we had turned our backs on. We have encountered and we should be transformed by the most generous act in all of history. And some of us, we act more like our kid struck out at T-ball over it. It's about as excited as we get. I would be willing to say that maybe, just maybe, the American church should be a little more extreme than we are. We've been comfortable and convenient for long enough. That brings me to my third point this morning. Generosity is more about stewardship than sacrifice. For a long time, churches have preached sacrificial giving. I think that's an admirable thing. Don't hear me say it's not. However, I have a couple issues with this idea of sacrifice. Because most of us, when they teach it, they say, well, you should give to the point where it hurts. Well, my first issue that I take with that is I'm certain for pretty much everyone that the point where we say it hurts and where it really does are a long way apart. We have cheapened this idea of what sacrifice actually is. We look at our budgets and we say, well, I can afford to give this and it not cost me anything. We've gone back to an amount versus an attitude. The second thing maybe that I really struggle with is generosity is not about me. Like somehow we still want to take it and make it about my money that I have given and what I have sacrificed. It's not about that. If generosity is causing me to look at me, I missed the point. Generosity should be about loving other people the way that God loves them. It's got nothing to do with me. And I think the biggest thing that I take issue with is just the word sacrifice in general. Because is it really a sacrifice to give away something that's not mine in the first place? Right, the definition of sacrifice is the act of losing something you own. I mean, the reality is I don't actually own anything. I'm just a steward of everything that God has blessed me with. I mean, that's what Hebrews 2:10 says, the very first part of that verse. For it was fitting that he, for whom and by whom all things exist. Right, if it hurts, maybe I just misunderstand what's mine. Because the answer is nothing. Why do I have the house that I have? Because God gave me the ability to work and make money to pay for that house. Why do I have the skills that I have? Because God blessed me and gave me the ability to do what He needs me to do on His mission. See, we think that we own fill in the blank, but do you really? It all exists because of God and it all belongs to God. That's what the verse says. The early church understood this. If you read in Acts chapter 2, you've got new believers, right? These guys weren't educated. The church hasn't even been around that long. They're being led by a bunch of fishermen. And yet you've got some wealthy members who they were willing to sell land and possessions and those things, and they would take the money and they would give it to the church so the church could provide for the people who didn't have. That's extreme, right? Didn't we just say maybe the American church could stand to be a little more extreme? Now here's a gut check, right? Because when I was writing this message, I'm like, I'm not doing that. I feel like most people here just thought, I'm not doing that. I mean, that's awesome. Good for them. I'm not selling my house. Right? Because in my mind, well, where are my wife and my kid going to live if I sell my house? Well, doesn't that reflect the fact that maybe I don't trust God's provision for our lives? I'm not telling everybody they should go sell their house tonight. I mean, what I am saying, maybe we let our common sense and things that make sense get in the way of what God's actually calling us to do. So here's where it all comes together, right? They had an attitude of generosity in response to the grace of God. And because the response drove the attitude, they had a healthy perspective on their stuff. See, it's foundational. It builds upon itself. They demonstrated their love for their brothers and sisters in a way that can only be described as generous. I think what they did and what they realized was that the call and the mission of God was much, much bigger than them. And that the only way that they could see to achieve that goal was to effectively steward everything that they had. They figured out that halfway in doesn't cut it. And I think most of us on our best days are halfway in. And I just want to keep reinforcing, generosity is not about money. In fact, I think I could give you an illustration that would really help put that into perspective. For those of you who have kids, right? I have a kid. It's been a crazy last year. Just been, they say days go slow and years go fast, and that's true. But I've been in student ministry for 10 years, and people always told me, you never understand what it's like to have a kid and to love your child until you have a child, right? And I was like, I know, because I'm about to kill your kid sometimes, right? I understand. But the last year, I've realized what that means, and it really is something you can't explain, right? I mean, you would do anything for your children, anything. You could put anything next to them, and you would always choose your children over them. Because we're possessive of them, right? They belong to us. And yes, it's our job to nurture them. It's our job to raise them. But it's our job to raise strong Christian adults, not safe children. Because ultimately, they don't belong to me. They don't belong to you. You're simply called to steward them as well. In the Old Testament book of 1 Samuel, we see this lady named Hannah, and she's barren. She can't have any children. And so she goes to the temple, and she just prays to God, and she says, God, just give me a child. So she has a little boy, and after Samuel is born, takes him to the temple while he's still a baby and says, God, this child is yours. And then at 12 years old, as is Jewish custom, she took him and she dropped him off the temple and left him to be trained. Generosity is not about the amount. It's not about the stuff. It's not about a requirement. And it's not about a sacrifice. It's about a response to all that God has blessed us with. Hannah was humbled by generosity, and it sparked her own. She understood how God had blessed her. So as we conclude this morning, I'm going to do something very different. Normally we would do an altar call, and I'm not going to do that. A couple of years ago, we started a building project called All About Jesus, because that's what generosity is all about. In most of the series folders, if you got one, there should be a blue card. If you didn't, you can do this on a piece of paper. It's irrelevant what it's written on. But we ask people to fill out commitment cards and say, hey, we need more space. Not for New Life. It could be whatever. It doesn't matter what name's on the sign out front. It doesn't matter who's on staff here. What matters is that God's doing big things here. If you're not sure why we need a building, you look around and like, well, there's an empty seat beside me. Go up to Kids Life. Wade through the 40 kids in every room, and then you'll know why. But 2 years ago, we handed these out, and we said, hey, we want you guys to commit to giving above and beyond what you already give. We need to build this building. They're building a new development in Locust. We don't have the space to minister to the people, and God has called us to reach those people. And people filled out the card, but for some reason, we missed the word commitment on the card. It became a check mark, right? We wrote, we're going to do this, and then we dropped it in a basket, and then majority of people just didn't give. I don't know what the reasons were. I'm sure for some people there were extenuating circumstances. But I'm going to ask you today, regardless of the date that may be on the card, to reconsider that. And I know it feels like things are going nowhere. Things are moving forward. And one of our biggest concerns is the commitment level. That's what we keep hearing. So I guess the question is, on the heels of Brandon's message last week and this week, are you a convenient attender or are you a committed attender? Because God's going to do big things here, one way or the other. It's a matter of if you're going to be all in. Are you going to be committed to this community? Or are you just going to show up when it's easy for you? I don't care if it's $5 a month. If that's what you feel like you can do, that's awesome. If you don't intend on following through, this is the first time you'll ever hear a pastor say this on the stage. If you don't intend on following through, don't fill that card out. Don't write anything on it. It's my prayer that as a church, that we would become known for our generosity, not because of who we are, but because of what God has already done for us. So as you leave, there's a white basket out in the foyer. You can drop those cards off. That's simple. No fanfare, no checking up and saying, did you? As the band comes back on stage, I want you to spend some time in prayer. I want you to seriously ask God, what would you have me commit to what you're doing? Because ultimately, this is about providing people the opportunity to experience new life in Christ. It's not about any of us. It's about the Great Commission and what He wants to do in Locust. So let's pray.